The 30th of April, 1483. Armed riders come down on the little market town of Stony Stratford at speed, hooves hammering the wet road, hooves throwing mud across the shop fronts. Inside, a boy of 12 is being dressed for the ride to London and his crown. Within the hour, his guardians are under arrest, and the boy king belongs to his uncle. 3 weeks earlier, everything had been ordinary. On the 9th of April, King Edward IV died at Westminster, aged only 40, after a short illness no one had expected to be fatal. He left a kingdom finally at peace after decades of civil war. He also left a throne to a child. The heir was Edward V, 12 years old, raised far from court at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border. His younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, was 9. 2 boys, born into the most powerful family in England. Their father's reign had rested on his own strength, and now that strength was gone. Power in England had split into 2 camps. Around the young king stood his mother's family, the Woodvilles, risen fast and resented deeply. Against them stood the old nobility, and above all, the dead king's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, named Lord Protector of the realm. Both sides understood the same thing. Whoever held the boy held England. Gloucester rode south to meet the royal party, joined by the Duke of Buckingham. At Northampton, they dined with the king's uncle, Earl Rivers, in apparent friendship. By morning, Rivers was a prisoner. Rivers, Richard Grey, and Thomas Vaughan were sent north in chains. And in June, all 3 were executed at Pontefract, without any trial worth the name. On the 4th of May, the boy king entered London beside his uncle, to bells and cheering crowds. It looked like a rescue. Gloucester rode bareheaded before him and proclaimed his loyalty in the streets. Nothing in the ceremony suggested that the 12-year-old at its center had, in any meaningful sense, already lost. He was lodged, in time, in the Tower of London. That was not sinister. The Tower was a working royal palace, the traditional lodging for a monarch in the days before a coronation. Its apartments hung with tapestry and its armories stocked for the great procession to Westminster. The date was fixed for the 22nd of June. His mother did not believe it. The night the news came from Stony Stratford, Elizabeth Woodville fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her daughters and her younger son, Richard of York. She took her furniture, her hangings, and her jewels, and she barricaded herself inside a church. She had done it once before and been proved right. On the 13th of June, the council met at the Tower. Midway through, Lord Hastings, the dead king's closest friend and a supporter of the boy's succession, was accused of treason and dragged from the chamber. He was beheaded that same day, without trial, on a log of timber in the Tower precinct. 3 days later, churchmen came to the sanctuary at Westminster. Cardinal Thomas Bourchier argued, promised, and finally prevailed, and the Queen handed over her 9-year-old son. Richard of York was rowed down river to join his brother. He was, they said, company for the king before the coronation. Neither boy would leave the Tower again. The coronation was postponed. Then it was abandoned. In its place, on the 22nd of June, a preacher named Ralph Shaw mounted the open-air pulpit at St. Paul's Cross and told London that the dead king had been secretly promised to another woman before his marriage. Therefore his sons were illegitimate. Therefore they could not reign. It was a legal argument, and it was decisive. On the 26th of June, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, took the throne as Richard III. He was crowned at Westminster on the 6th of July in one of the most splendid ceremonies England had seen. Somewhere downriver, behind stone walls, the crowned king's nephews remained. An Italian visitor named Dominic Mancini was in London that summer, writing down what he heard. He recorded that after the new king's accession, Edward and his brother were withdrawn into the inner apartments of the Tower. They were seen more and more rarely behind the bars and windows. Then they ceased to appear altogether. Mancini recorded one detail that has never lost its chill. The boy king's attendant physician, Dr. John Argentine, reported that Edward sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance, because he believed that death was facing him. A 12-year-old, in a palace, preparing himself to die. Other Londoners remembered seeing them earlier that summer, shooting and playing in the garden of the Tower, by sundry times. That is the last ordinary picture anyone has of Edward V and Richard of York. Two boys with a bow, in a walled garden, in the sunlight. In the last weeks anyone can place them alive. Mancini left England in July, before the story ended. He wrote that he had already seen many men burst into tears when the young king was mentioned, and that whether the boy had been done away with, and by what manner of death, he had not been able to discover. That is where the record simply stops. In October, southern England rose in revolt. The rising had begun as a plot to free the boys and restore Edward V. Somewhere in its planning, the object changed. The rebels transferred their hopes to a distant exile named Henry Tudor. The most natural reading is the darkest one. The men closest to the plot had concluded that there was no longer anyone to rescue. The rebellion drowned. Storms and flooding broke the rebel armies apart before they could join. The Duke of Buckingham, the man who had ridden at Richard's side from the very beginning, was captured and beheaded at Salisbury on the 2nd of November. Whatever he knew about the boys went with him. The rumor was already crossing the Channel. In January 1484, the Chancellor of France, Guillaume de Rochefort, addressed the assembled estates at Tours and spoke of the murder of the children of the English king. Whether it was intelligence or propaganda, foreign courts were now discussing the boys in the past tense. In England, the same thing was being whispered more carefully. The chronicler of Crowland Abbey, writing within 3 years, noted a rumor that the two sons of King Edward had been put to death, but nobody knew how. Rumor, in 1483, was often the only surviving form of news. The loudest evidence is a silence. Richard III never produced the boys. He never displayed them, never paraded them, never proved them alive, though doing so would have destroyed the rebellions raised in their name. He also never publicly accused anyone else of harming them. He simply did not speak of them again. In March 1484, Elizabeth Woodville left sanctuary with her daughters, after the king swore a public oath before the Lords and the Mayor of London to keep them safe. Historians have argued about that decision ever since. Was it the act of a mother who knew her sons lived, or the woman who had run out of options? On the 22nd of August, 1485, Richard III died in the mud at Bosworth Field, charging his rival's standard. He was the last English king to be killed in battle. Henry Tudor was crowned on the field. The new dynasty inherited the country, the crown, and the question. Henry VII had every reason to publish the truth, and never quite did. His parliament condemned Richard in sweeping language, including the shedding of infants' blood, but named no victims, no place, and no date. For a regime built on discrediting its predecessor, that vagueness is remarkable, and it has fed suspicion for 5 centuries. Then the dead began coming back. In 1491, a young man appeared in Ireland claiming to be Richard, Duke of York. The younger prince escaped from the Tower. Foreign courts received him as a prince. He troubled Henry VII for 8 years, invaded twice, and was finally captured, made to confess he was a Fleming named Perkin Warbeck, and hanged in 1499. In 1502, a knight named Sir James Tyrrell was executed for treason in another matter entirely. Years afterwards, Thomas More wrote that Tyrrell had confessed to the murder of the princes, smothered in their beds, and buried at a stair-foot, then moved to a secret grave. No record of that confession survives. More was writing about 30 years after the fact, under the dynasty that had replaced Richard. So the suspects line up, and none of them fits cleanly. Richard III had the motive, the custody, and the silence. Buckingham had ambition and access, and died before he could be questioned. Henry Tudor had the greatest interest in their deaths, but was in exile in Brittany while they were still being cited. Motive is not proof. Almost 2 centuries later, in 1674, workmen were demolishing a staircase against the White Tower. About 10 feet down, beneath the stone, they broke into a wooden box. Inside were the bones of 2 children. The find was reported at once, and the coincidence with More's account was impossible to ignore. King Charles II accepted them as the princes. In 1678, the bones were placed in a marble urn, designed by Christopher Wren, and interred in Westminster Abbey, a few paces from the tombs of their own family. They were examined once, in 1933, by an archivist and an anatomist who judged them to be children of roughly the right ages. That examination could not establish sex, could not establish date, and would not satisfy any modern laboratory. Requests to test the bones with modern methods have been refused, so the urn stands sealed, a few hundred yards from where the boys were last seen alive, holding an answer that nobody is permitted to read. What is certain is very small. 2 brothers, 12 and 9, entered a fortress in the summer of 1483 and were never reliably seen again. Everything after that is inference, rumor, and interest. The tower still stands above the river, unchanged in its outline, and it has kept the one detail that would settle the argument for more than 500 years.